Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on how businesses can help deliver natural climate solutions across the UK and the benefits those projects bring to the business and to the local environments and communities. My name is Tom Popple and I'm a Senior Manager for Climate Change and Sustainability at Natural Capital Partners. We've had a really strong sign-up rate amongst large businesses, some based in the UK and some from further afield, such as the US and Europe, all with what we're going to seem to be footprints in the United Kingdom. With COP coming up and net zero commitments on the rise, many companies are looking to support local, tangible climate solutions here in the UK. And after all, trees are like magic machines, cost-effective, scalable, and can draw down carbon while providing habitats for a range of wildlife. Just to run through a few logistics, just to ensure that you're in your best behavior. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour and we'll leave the final 15 minutes or so at the end for audience questions. You're all muted in listen only mode, so please use the panel on the right hand side of the screen to submit any questions and then we'll go through them at the end. The idea for this webinar, like many, is for it to be as interactive as possible, so please send through any and all questions to the team and we'll filter through those and answer them. Those that we don't get through in today's session, we'll refer back afterwards. Now, moving on to our panelists. We've got a star-studded cast and lineup here of the who's who of the forestry world and those organisations that are supporting it too. So we're going to hear from Dr. Vicky West, Woodland Carbon Code Manager at Scottish Forestry, David Bliss, the CEO at Lowther Estates, and Matthew, the Director of Social Innovation at Refinitiv and LSEG Business, and then myself, as you mentioned, as well. As always, we like to kick off with a poll just to check out who's listening and who's paying attention. So we can move to our first poll for the session. Here we go, and I'll read it out if you'd like to just mark an answer. So to what extent does your organisation integrate natural climate solutions, such as this being reforestation that we're going to talk about, into your climate strategy? Your options are: supporting natural climate solutions is part of our climate strategy, supporting is part of our strategy, sorry, it's a big part, is part of our strategy, and yet does not feature in our climate strategy. So let's find out who is supporting natural climate solutions and at what level. Gives us a sense of the audience that we're shooting at. There we go, a mixed bag. So what do we have there? Around a third of the audience currently supporting as a big part of their climate strategy, and 45% as part of it, and then 25% not featuring. So I guess the idea here for this session is to see if we can get those 25% over the line. So I'm going to kick off just to set the context for the webinar itself. If we'd like to move on to those slides, please. Fantastic. So really what we're talking about here is climate action closer to home. And I want to bring it down to a level where we're just talking what businesses are doing in terms of their drivers and objectives. So what we're seeing is that more organizations, more businesses are seeking to reach net zero emissions. And for many of those organizations, it's aligning with science. So what we're seeking to do in that is to balance the emissions that we're generating from our business over time with carbon sinks. Many organizations are aligning to the Science Based Targets Initiative, which follows the ambition to limit the amount of global warming, hopefully to 1.5 degrees or no greater. And really what that means is organizations setting really robust decarbonization strategies and timelines and plans in order for them to reduce their emissions. But fundamentally, there is going to be residual emissions left over from that process, no matter how much they can support, no matter how much technology advances. And it's those residual emissions that are being addressed through carbon sinks, like reforestation as a carbon removal. Carbon sinks themselves come in two forms. We have those that are existing sinks, and we have those that focus on the creation of new sinks. For this, reforestation is the development of new sinks. Now, for many businesses, it's about focusing that financing of climate action in locations that they care about. That could be operational, that could be where their value chain is, it's where other stakeholders or interest parties may be. Some organizations focus their in areas of the greatest need, where we're seeing the impacts of climate change, or where we're seeing severe degradation. For the UK, many businesses have supported climate action in the UK and in forestry for many years, since the inception of the Woodland Carbon Code that we're going to be finding out about. But actually, as a proportion of overall action, it's been a minority player. Lots of organizations have generally supported projects in other locations, and that's a factor of a few things. One being the development of the UK market in terms of the supply of forestry types projects is smaller compared to other locations, but also the focus on price and ensuring that the projects that they fund are delivering the best value for the business. But the UK is now in the limelight, with COP26 taking place later in the year, and many homegrown British brands taking leadership positions. We're seeing interest in UK-based climate solutions, those closer to home, more now than ever. And so there is a boom of interest in what's possible in the United Kingdom. And we're seeing emerging trends in that to focus on things around restorative impacts, and then rewilding also comes in. And I think within the British psyche, the connection, the rebalancing with nature is an important part of business objectives. The next slide, please. So as we go on and we think about, well, why are businesses interested in focusing on initiatives like reforestation in the UK? The truth is there are many different objectives for businesses. Some focus solely on a climate goal, an objective. Their aim to be net zero is the drive to check a box in terms of getting their emissions down. For others, it's about the power and the role that potentially climate financing can deliver for their brand and their stakeholders and what they really care about. What you see now in the slide are 6 areas of potential benefits and value that could be created through supporting reforestation in the UK, and there are many others in between. You'll hear about them today from the panelists. Up in the left is about supporting biodiversity, about supporting rewilding, enhancing and rehabilitating ecosystems, particularly when we're focusing on the creation of native-based woodlands. That's also important for those species that we have here in the UK that could be threatened or vulnerable. And increasingly, we're seeing in the news feeds here in the UK about many of those biodiversity impacts and the need to support more space for nature. Second, looking at watershed management. Climate change in the UK is going to have a dramatic impact on the amount and the timing and the intensity of our weather systems. And with that, we're going to be seeing changes in rainfall and patterns. Forestry provides a really good mechanism for adapting the land to increasing changes in weather systems and precipitation. So watershed management can be a real positive benefit, and some companies like to focus on water and climate adaptation as being one of those themes. Community. These projects are situated in rural communities. They're situated in areas where landowners and partners come together to deliver assets and benefits. It also provides jobs, education, employment opportunities. That could be interesting for lots of companies. And the landowners themselves, large and small, all contributing together to deliver these projects. It provides a diversification of that income stream and funding. And we're going to hear a little bit about that when we hear from David in terms of the way the estate has been managed. But also, it's interesting for lots of young people, millennials, Generation X, to be involved in climate action. And so it can often attract young people into the rural areas to be supporting some of the innovative solutions and projects around climate action. For those that don't live in the area, it provides access to amenity and leisure facilities, space, nature, fresh air. And again, we'll be hearing about that a little bit later. And then finally, as I mentioned, the UK has played a relatively small part in financing of natural climate solutions today. But really, it's an opportunity now to catalyze that, to build on the momentum and focus on what can be done closer to home. And so that we see a potential here for the growth of natural climate solutions and reforestation in the UK, and many businesses want to stride a path in that way. Next slide, as we move on. Now, this one is a little bit about myth busting, just to be fair. So what's really important here is about the integrity and credibility of claims that businesses can make around the climate action that they're taking. Now, importantly, when you create a forest and you plant trees, the impact on climate doesn't happen straight away. It happens as the tree grows, as it matures over time. And so in the programs that you design for businesses, it's important that you plan that carbon removal, that sequestration over time to align with the footprint of the business as it changes. So planting trees today does not give you a claim on carbon today. That's false. It can take up to 100 years in some of the cases in the United Kingdom, and it's important to track that. What you see on the screen here then is just an example of a potential growth curve of trees and carbon over time. So as you can see in the formative years in year 0, what we actually do is we validate the carbon that we expect to come from the project. This is issuing something called a PIU, a pending issuance unit. I'm going to hear a little bit more about that when Vicky talks. Over time, as those trees go, we go into the forest, it gets monitored, it gets validated, so it gets verified. And then we actually have the carbon credits, the real emission reductions that we can use against our footprint. And they are the WCUs, the Woodland Carbon Units. And they're the things that are really valuable to businesses to align with their net zero goals and objectives. Next slide, please. And then finally, really to bring it all together, my wedge slide, as I call it, building UK reforestation into your program. Really what we're talking about is we're building the role of climate financing into your program, external financing of emission reductions into your program. For a business to be net zero, there are 3 mechanisms that get deployed often. One of those is addressing avoidable emissions. That's the blue wedge that you see there. Reducing your footprint over time, leaner and meaner operations as you invest into decarbonisation and as technology solutions become available. So if your emission trajectory from 2020 up to 2050, then you're going to be reducing your footprint over time. The light green wedge that you see there is achieving carbon neutrality today. That's using carbon offsets and credits to ensure that your reported footprint today in 2021 can also be carbon neutral to show immediate action against climate change. And then finally, the dark green wedge. Again, this is the long-term financing unavoidable emissions, seeking to create a forest, create a sink in the future that can deliver you emission reductions when you need to reach your net zero year. Net zero within the Paris Agreement is focused on 2050, but we see corporates and businesses going earlier. The leaders right now are around 2030 in terms of achieving their net zero goals and objectives, with some of the fast followers coming up in 2040. The crucial part is because it takes a while for those trees to grow, up to 100 years in the case of the UK in terms of how we monitor and report the carbon benefits, it's important to finance those trees today, finance the creation of forests today, because you'll be waiting until the future to receive that benefit. There's a little bit of a taster of how we think about net zero, how we think about reforestation, how we think about the UK, and how that plays in. And now we're going to hear from the other panelists in terms of the application of that in reality. So I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Vicky West, if I can, to give an overview of the Woodland Carbon Code. Thank you. Vicky, and a question for you just in the intro. Please let us know what your favorite woodland animal is, or creature. It could be anything.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So I'm Vicky West and I work for Scottish Forestry. I'll just tell you my favourite woodland creature is the capercaillie. Being in Scotland, it has to be a Scottish one. And that's partly because we want to create lots more habitat for this very rare bird to enable it to thrive more within Scotland. So I'd like to give you a little bit of information about the Carbon Code itself and the integrity of the standard. And David is going to give you a bit more information later about the project that is happening on the estate that he manages. So the Woodland Carbon Code is a government-backed standard for just woodland creation at the moment. So it helps organisations like yourselves compensate for UK-based emissions. Tom's just done a really good example of how that means your emissions in the future. If you plant trees today, it will be compensating for your future emissions. So it helps you reach your net zero target. It also helps the UK reach their challenging net zero targets. The Woodland Carbon Code is endorsed by ACROA. It's featured in the British Standards Institute's PAS 2060 Standard for Carbon Neutrality. as well as in the government's environmental reporting guidelines, including the SECR section for those companies that are mandated to report their emissions. The code was launched in 2011 and developed by the Forestry Commission, but it's now managed by Scottish Forestry on behalf of all the government departments across the UK. Before I go on any further, I just wanted to let you know that there is also a peatland code. I'm not going to mention any more about peatlands other than to say that everything I'm saying for woodland also applies to peatland restoration projects, and you can purchase emissions reduction credits from projects where peatland is restored so that those peatlands emit less carbon dioxide. If we go on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the code and the things which underpin it to ensure that it's got high integrity. So the first thing is that we've developed high standards. We looked at what's happening across the world and took the best from CDM, VCS and Verra standards and combined that with the UK legislation in place in the country. And we also looked at the main parts of a carbon standard to make sure that they're covered, including additionality, that these projects really need the carbon finance to make them go ahead, permanence, and projects have to put some of their carbon units in a buffer in case of any future losses to make sure that the credits people buy are permanent. And also thinking about the baseline and leakage, other things you might have heard if you are aware of other carbon standards. So there's three things that underpin the standard. The first one is robust science, and Forest Research, the government research agency, have come up with two tools to help us with that. I've got a similar graph to Tom here. So we have a tool that helps us predict carbon sequestration for different woodlands in different places. So that might be the blue line. And then we have a measurement protocol, which helps us measure those trees over time to work out how much carbon they've actually sequestered. And we do that at year 5 and every 10 years. Tom mentioned these two types of unit. So at each verification every 10 years, we convert our pending issuance unit or promise to deliver carbon into a unit of real sequestered carbon. So that's the science. The standard also requires independent validation and verification, and there are two bodies that can do that at the moment, the Soil Association and Organic Farmers and Growers. And both those bodies have to be accredited by UCAS, the UK accreditation standard, to ISO 14065, which is an ISO standard for carbon measurement and monitoring. As well as having science and independent validation and verification of our projects, we also have a transparent registry. We use the IHS Market Registry, which is a global leader in provision of registries for ecosystem services for carbon, water, and the like. The registry enables us to track all the projects in our system, the units that are issued, when they're transferred to different buyers, so we can keep track of who owns credits and who uses them when they use them in their emissions reduction reports. I think I've probably said enough about the two types of unit. So we have these pending issuance units, which are a promise to deliver in future. Once we know the carbon's actually there in the woodland, we convert them to woodland carbon units. We'll go on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to say as well that woodlands are not just about carbon, they provide many other benefits. So we have a woodland benefits tool, which helps projects to assess how well they're doing relative to others in 4 different areas of wildlife or biodiversity, water, which could include flood mitigation, community and economy. There's also many other benefits for companies who are looking to invest in a woodland in the UK in particular, and that they're local and tangible. You can engage your employees in those projects and potentially your customers. One of these pictures is the employees from a company who actually went out to help plant the trees. Other companies have said that it has helped them with their staff retention as well. There's obviously PR opportunities and it allows you to have some product differentiation by buying from these UK projects. As well as these benefits, we tried to evaluate in monetary terms some of the benefits provided by woodland carbon projects. So FTech did some work for us in 2016, and they worked out that for each ton of CO2 purchased from a Woodland Carbon Code project, you're also getting these other benefits in terms of between 20 and 100 pounds worth of biodiversity benefit, 65 to 75 pounds worth of recreation benefit. £7 is added to the GVA, and around £10 worth of air quality benefit, although it depends how urban the woodland is. Also, 13% of projects were in a priority area for flood mitigation or water quality improvements, and 6% of the sites were accessible by the most deprived communities in the UK. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a bit of background on the number of projects and where they are. So the map on the right-hand side shows the location of all the projects that are registered with the Carbon Code so far. The light green ones are what we call under development. So they've registered with us, but they've not had any checks yet. The middle green ones are validated. So they've been checked at the outset, and we're fairly certain how much carbon they're likely to sequester over their lifetime. And the dark green ones are verified, meaning we've had a look at them at year 5 to check how much carbon has already been sequestered. So there's around 300 projects which are already validated and checked at the outset, and they're predicted to sequester over 5.5 million tonnes over their lifetime. And of those, almost 100 have been checked at year 5, and those 100 are likely to sequester 1.3 million tonnes over their lifetime. There's also another 300 projects that are under development and probably still looking for funding. Those projects are likely to sequester another 4 million tonnes of CO2 over their lifetime. And just a bit of qualification about the number of units available and already sold. So we've talked about these 2 different types of units, and this really highlights the point that you can't really use these units now to call yourself carbon neutral, because there's 7,000 units have been verified so far from the 91 projects, and of those less than 800 are now available for sale. That said, in terms of pending issuance units, which are going to be delivered in future, 3.2 million of those have been issued so far, of which just over 2 million are sold and about 1 million are available for sale. So there's plenty of opportunity with the validated projects to look for opportunities there. If we go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight a bit about the scale of the challenge at the moment as well. So the current planting rate in the UK is around 13,000 hectares of woodland per year, and we have about 13% of the land covered with woodland. The Climate Change Committee, in their recommendations for the 6th carbon budget, said that we need to be planting not 13 but 30,000 hectares of new woodland every year between now and 2035. And once we get to 2035, between then and 2050, we need to be planting between 50 and 70,000 hectares of woodland every year between then and 2050 in order that we can reach our 6th carbon budget and net zero by 2050. So this is a massive increase in the rate of woodland creation, and we need to build capacity to enable that to happen in terms of the whole forest industry, from the nurseries, the staff to plant and manage those woodlands, getting landowners engaged. The majority of the land is privately owned, and we need to have those landowners engaged in this mission. The other challenge is financing these projects. It's not cheap to change land use, and in moving to woodlands, landowners will be losing other income. And then in terms of making the carbon market work, greater price transparency and improved mechanisms to enable the connections between buyers and sellers is going to help as well. And then I just want to say, finally, the really important point is that whilst we massively scale up, we need to make sure that we're still planting the right tree in the right place for the right reasons. So we need to think about the soil, the climate, the landscape, integrating in with other habitats and land uses around the woodland, and integrating with communities and their wishes as well. And the one thing that makes sure we hold up high standards in that regard is the UK forestry standard, which is renowned globally as a really high standard for sustainable forest management. So hopefully that will keep us on the right track. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Tom.
Great stuff. Thanks a million, Vicky. Always interesting to kind of hear the run through of the Woodland Carbon Code and how it operates. We've had some questions come through, so please keep coming with those. I did just want to take one now and put it to you, because given that it's straight after your presentation, if I can, which is a question around the performance gap between the PIU and the WCU. You know, how well is that tracked? Is there some kind of indicator you can share?
So what we do, we get projects to predict how much carbon they're going to sequester upfront, and that prediction is really conservative. PIUs aren't guaranteed, and it's important to make that clear. And when we verify a project, we work out how much is actually sequestered. So from the landowner's point of view, they could end up with more or fewer carbon credits. So it's important to keep that in mind. In terms of the 90 projects that have been through the system already, we kind of have a traffic light system as to how well they're doing, and they get a red, amber, green on their verification statement. So of those 90, I think just a handful were, maybe 5, had an amber warning, which meant they needed to make some corrective actions to ensure that the sequestration would happen in future. And I think there's been 1 or 2 that had a red warning, which was there were concerns about the delivery in future. And those projects needed to do more significant replanting and management of the land to ensure that, for example, deer weren't getting into the site and browsing on the new trees.
Very good. Thanks, Vicky. That's great extra insight. So we're going to move over now, if we can, to David, who is the CEO of the Loudon Estate up in the Lake District. And David's going to tell us a little bit more about the Woodland Carbon Code project on his land and how the scheme benefits landowners specifically, but also the wildlife you can find up there. So David, over to you. And the same question, what's your favorite woodland creature, please, to lighten it up?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, my name's David Bliss, the CEO of Lauber. My favourite woodland animal, I'm a little bit torn between beavers and red squirrels, because we have red squirrels and we absolutely love them up here because we're on the last frontier defending them. But probably my favourite at the moment is the beaver, just because we managed to reintroduce the beaver into Cumbria and onto the estate after 400 years, which is a really exciting time for us. So today I want to talk to you about our Woodland Carbon Code project, but to get us to that point, I just want to tell you a little bit about Lauber Estate itself initially. Lauber Estate, as you can see, is almost on the border between the Scotland and England, right up beside Penrith, on the edge of the UNESCO Lake District National Park. The national park at the moment is attracting over 19,000 people, 19 million people a year, so and escalating the whole time. The estate's been in the same family for 800 years, So you can see it's a long-term proposition that we're running up here. And it amounts, our side of the family estates amounts to over 36,000 acres, with a lot of traditional woodland and a castle in the middle. The castle itself is attracting at the moment over 100,000 visitors every year. And we're trying to connect those people that are coming into the woodland and into the environment we're trying to protect. So that involves new cycleways that we're putting in place, footpaths, and importantly, a learning from the land project, where we're working with a trust called the Ernest Cook Trust. If we all remember Thomas Cook, that family. He left some money to the Ernest Cook Trust, and working with them, we're now doing learning from the land project, where we're getting a lot of troubled kids and adults coming out and learning about the heritage of the land and the changes in the landscape that we're leading. That's leading us into a rewilding project across the estate, which is one of the largest ones, I suppose. We're up to 5,000 acres of complete rewilding. And then on top of that, we're doing reintroductions as well, as we briefly mentioned. We've got the beaver reintroduction going on and the red squirrel introduction. Next slide, please. So when you start looking at a large estate, and this is just a small part of it, as you can see, 8,000 acres, which is the home farm, you have to come up with a plan. Because as Vicky said, you've got to get the trees in the right place for a start off, and that takes years of planning. You know, even before you start doing the application, you've got to decide if you want to do it. If you want to commit that land for 100 years at least, or forever, to be honest. We want it to be forever. So we did it for a process called the Whole Estate Plan, which we did with the local National Park Association, who helped us put it together. And we looked at all our eco assets and all our ecosystems and reviewed those. And very quickly, we learned that we weren't particularly looking after our eco assets particularly well. We were worried about our soil runoff. Could we get massive rainfall events now? Some of you might have heard of Storm Desmond. In Storm Desmond, we got a foot of rain in 24 hours. You know, that literally you're seeing the water come off the fields, including your soil. We were worried about our soils. We were also worried about our air pollution. This is ammonia we're all becoming conscious of from cattle and sheep. And we were worried about our arable, ploughing fields, and the associated carbon release and runoff. But the whole process of planning it led to us creating what we felt was a fantastic area of woodland. And that's what we're going to come on to next. You know, the creation of Jack's Wood. Jack's Wood is built on the edge of the largest deer park in England. So before we started planting, we looked at all the heritage of the area and all the scheduled ancient monuments, obviously, that we've got. And the area was enclosed in 1238. And the produce at that time was a wild from a parkland deer to supply the castle. The whole estate plan also led us into looking at what's going to be beside Jack's Wood. We still want to farm. We don't want it all as woodland. So we've got a regenerative dairy now. And you know, our dairy cows, instead of being housed inside, are now trying to be outside as much as possible. We're trying to reduce the carbon concentrates. We're trying to use the manure they produce in a constructive way, i.e. separate it so we keep the ammonia levels down. And we're also looking at how we can manage those cows right through to the point of using the milk locally rather than shipping it and selling it to dairies a considerable distance away. We've also got longhorn cattle, native breed cattle, reintroduced. We've got a partnership going on with RSPB and United Utilities. And again, that's to protect our water, but it's also to protect the endangered landscape that we all live in. Yeah, it's a difficult time for farming at the moment, as we're all aware. And change for farmers is incredibly difficult because it takes a long time to plan. So with the BPS, that's the basic payment scheme that farmers receive, disappearing in 5 years' time, we're incredibly conscious of that. How are those farmers going to transition from a guaranteed payment to a new greener payment? So we're looking into the partnership that will allow funding to advise those farmers and how we might be able to get them into new environmental schemes. So the next slide, please. So as we went through the planning process, we quickly decided we wanted to build a forest. We called it Jack's Forest, after the forest that had been on the estate for 40 years. And this map, you can't really see the fine writing, but it gives you some idea of the scale of the estate. This is a small area really, but it's one of 300 hectares. And it's a beautiful area of land just on the edge of the M6. So many of you will look into it for years to come, I'm sure, as you drive up the M6 towards Scotland. And it's an area that has gone through land change already. It used to be common land years ago. When I say common, it was literally an unwalled system, an unfenced system of grassland and scrub. We're going back 500 years there, at least. But after the war, the Second World War, there was a great push to intensify farmland. And you can see there straight lines. And those straight lines that you can see show barbed wire fences that were created in the 1950s. There were 31 kilometers of those fences. And they made small field patterns, which were then used for beef production. And there was a large beef building put up there. And this area of land held 300 cows producing calves, which were then fattened and sold as beef. And the land was drained, and the lime was put on the land to make it more productive. But of course, no one really thought about what it was. It was land at nearly 1,000 feet. So land at 1,000 feet is very cold land. It gets a lot of rainfall. Yeah, we can have 70 inches of rain quite easily up on this section. And the runoff was enormous. Our soils were disappearing, our organic matters were falling in that soil. So we wanted to restore the landscape in a modern way, I suppose. We've always been a wooded estate. Something like 30% of our area is woodland. So we looked at how we could put a woodland together, which would allow us to produce constructive timber, which is a Sitka forest, but also broadleaf woodland. So you'll see there, the yellow area represents the Sitka, so that's your production forestry. And the blue areas, the light blue areas, that's our broadleaf woodland framing the new Sitka woodland. And then in all the boxes that you can't quite read, show all our constraints. So all our constraints at the bottom, we've re-meandered a river, for example, and slowed the flow. So that woodland isn't only slowing the flow of water, but when the water does hit the stream, we've put bends back into it to try and hold the river back from the triple SSI, which is on the right. We've then got breaks in our woodland planting area. And those breaks are for viewpoints from bridle paths and footpaths. So when people access our land, the view that they've enjoyed with their grandchildren or themselves isn't disturbed. We've then got areas that we've left open because of habitat. So that's often the red squirrel area, for example, where the trees have been there. We don't want to completely go in and plant the wrong type of tree. We want to be planting the beech trees where the red squirrels are. We've then got areas of scheduled ancient monuments, which again, we don't want to infringe upon. So you'll see areas of buffer zones left around those. We've then got to consider we're in the Lake District, and this is the largest planting in the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So sight lines from 20 miles away were considered. We've got bronze settlements at the very northern point. So you can see this all takes a considerable amount of time and planning, but luckily the Forestry Commission are there to support you through this process, and they do help fund that application process. So the next slide, please. So the Woodland Carbon Code, well, we've all learned from Vicky and about the Woodland Carbon Code, but what did it do for us? Well, the Woodland Carbon Code, I suppose, is something I've known about since its onset, and what it does, it gives us a structure. It reminded us that the support's there. because to plant trees, it's not a very sensible thing to do financially, to be honest. You have to love it. You have to really want to do it. We get grant aid to do it, but the grant aid really just covers the cost of putting the tree in the ground. And that cost has to be cash flowed as well. So if I said to you that, you know, by the time you plant a woodland like this, it cost me £300,000, and you have to pay that before you can reclaim the grant, etc. And you've got the VAT to pay on top of that. So it can put enormous cash flow strains onto an estate. The Woodland Carbon Code gives you that guarantee that if you can prove that the additionality of the carbon helps, i.e. it gives you the confidence and the financial benefit of planting those trees and the need, you will end up with the credits that you can trade. And that's what we've managed to do. We have managed to register this land for the Woodland Carbon Code, and we have managed to sell those credits. And that gave us the confidence not only to do Jackswood 1, but Jackswood 2 as well. And we've done it with companies that we're really quite proud of, you know, and hopefully they're proud of the planting. We've got signs up, we've got good access to the M6, so you can come up in the car or you can come on a train. We welcome people onto the estate to come and see the planting. We want to see people enjoying what they're involved in. And I think that's an important part of the Carbon Code. You know, people name the woods, for example. You know, it's something we're considering rolling out. You know, should the sponsor of the carbon purchaser be able to name it on the Ordnance Survey plans? You know, obviously there's limits on what you can call a wood, but it would be something that's well worth exploring and give companies the confidence that it's there for them for a long, long time. So we're particularly proud of those companies that have sponsored us. But it also gives a really good structure to work within. The whole verification process is one of, it's a good standard to go through. And we feel by the time we get to the end of it, we've got a really good scheme there that we know people can trust. So I would certainly recommend it. And you know, we're looking to plant a lot more woodland in the future. And we will be looking to the Woodland Carbon Code as a way of verifying those projects going forward. I think that's all I've got to cover at the moment, and I look forward to receiving any questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, David, for giving us a real insight into the way an estate is managed and all the considerations that you have on your plate. I don't envy you in your job. I imagine you have a stack of paper there of to-dos as well. And I do actually have some questions for you, which I'll leave to the end just to give enough time for Matt to cover off. So thanks a million, David. And definitely sign me up for a project visit when COVID is over as well. So now we're going to turn to Matt O'Shea from Refinitiv, which is an LSEG business, to give the business perspective. And I'm really interested in what Matt's going to have to say about innovation, the way they track and monitor their financing of climate action and trees. So Matt, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining us. Oh, and don't forget to mention your favorite woodland creature as well.
Of course, how could I forget, Tom? Thank you so much, and pleasure to be with everyone today, dialing in for this call. Some fantastic insights already, and I've certainly been scribbling away, making my own notes as Vicky and David have been running through their presentations, so thank you for that. My favourite woodland creature would probably have to be, and I've had more time to think about this now, Tom, so I would probably be a rabbit, primarily because it invokes nostalgia. It's for nostalgic reasons and memories of walking through the woodlands as I was growing up. I used to have a Peter Rabbit soft toy growing up as a child that I kept with me all the time. So it would have to be rabbits, I'm afraid. Great. So yeah, as Tom mentioned, my name is Matthew O'Shea. I am Director of Social Innovation and Philanthropy at the London Stock Exchange Group. And I am thrilled to be able to share with you our own tree planting and conservation journey with you that we've been on for the past 6 to 8 months. So really early on in our stage, but I'm hoping that I can share with you some insights and some food for thought as I described the process we've gone through and how we've worked with Natural Capital Partners, UK Forest Creation, and looked at sites that have been UK Forestry Standard approved and initiated at a Woodland Carbon Code perspective. So yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into that. But just to clarify, for those of you that may or may not be aware, I did work for Refinitiv, which has recently become part of the London Stock Exchange group. So if you do see reference to both Refinitiv and London Stock Exchange group throughout this presentation, that's why. And you may have also recently seen in the news that London Stock Exchange group have announced that they're the first global exchange to commit to net zero. And it's really timely, therefore, that we've been invited to speak to you all and share our journey and share an element of what we're trying to do in order to achieve that through tree planting and conservation. So let's get to the important piece. Rosie, if you can move to the next slide. Great, perfect. Thank you very much. And talk about our tree planting and conservation initiative. So we set a target as a company to plant and conserve 1 million trees by 2020. And this really started initially before we even set that goal back in the summer of 2019, where we wanted to adopt Ecosia as our default search engine as an organization to try and capture all our search activity as an organization and plant trees whilst doing so with our employees. And we saw so much uptake and so much enthusiasm, passion coming from our employees and steps, most importantly. By the end of kind of winter 2019, we'd had a bit of a dashboard view showing 2,500 trees planted, which, by the way, we're now at around 10,000 as a result of that continued use. And we thought, this is something that we'd really like to build on and actually take it a step further and think of something that was a lot more tangible, that was physical and could really be verified in terms of numbers, steps, and all the great information that Vicky pulled up on a couple of slides earlier on around that validation and justification and reasoning as to why we should be doing this. That moving to summer 2020, taking it that step further, which is why we started to work with Natural Capital Partners to find a site. A first site we wanted to launch on World Environment Day, June the 5th last year, and plant a tree per employee. That was the initial goal that we thought would be quite nice to launch the initiative on World Environment Day. So very fortunate to have found a site up in the Highlands in Scotland and have funded a planting of 45,000 trees in that site alone. I think it's around 28 hectares, which was great for us to launch. And I'll touch on some of the business value elements of that and why I would thoroughly recommend that process and the kind of feedback we've received as a result of that. But we've grown since then to 4 sites globally. It's an initiative that is clearly taking us up to 2030, and we're just shy of around 100,000 trees planted now and conserved over a 6-month period. And that little icon there is an animated GIF that looks as though it's just frozen, but never mind. It's a little icon that shows the target for 1 million trees by 2030. But we're still very early into this, and I think that's another important point to make. We are 6 months in, really, just over 6 months, really, from our first site funded as an organisation with Natural Capital Partners and UK Forest Creation. But I'm hoping, going through that journey and some of the key takeaways that I've learned specifically over the past couple of months, that provide some food for thought for those of you on this call. And hopefully, if you're in your own planning stages of launching an initiative or looking to try and expand what you're currently doing, I'm hoping the next slide could serve as useful information. So moving on to the business value side of things, I think it's hugely important to think about how you can capture and channel all of this enthusiasm for sustainability initiatives, tree planting, wildlife conservation, ocean protection, how we can harness all that enthusiasm and channel it from an employee engagement perspective, at least, in a way that's measured, in a way that's effective, and in a way that that doesn't dampen that enthusiasm, but actually inspires your employees and partners and clients that you work with. Clearly, we've probably all seen a lot of the huge announcements on LinkedIn feeds around big brands and organizations planting trees and committing to a certain amount of trees planted, etc. And it really is a huge driver for internal conversations. We've seen that at Refinitiv and the London Stock Exchange Group, with employees coming to us asking, what are we doing in this space? Is there something that they can get involved with? And that's really when we look at that first diagram or first icon on the left, the employee piece, really why that is hugely, hugely important. Not just to commit to a certain target as an organization and fund the planting and conservation of trees, but also, if you can, to try and really make that personal connection with why you're doing that, and with your employees that will want to be part of that journey with you. And that's one of the reasons why, when we launched in June last year, we said we'll plant 1 tree per current Refinitiv employee and any future Refinitiv employee that joins, to continue expanding and growing that initiative. And that went down really, really well from an employee engagement perspective. I will say, be warned with the influx of emails that you'll receive with really passionate employees suggesting new sites and new ways to plant trees, and what we should be doing in various global locations around the world. But it really, really was one of my highlights last year from an employee engagement perspective. We got such great feedback. And the initial plan obviously was to try and make it a little more practical and in person, but with the virtual environment we were working in last year, we had to think a little bit creatively about how we can keep our employees, customers and partners updated on that initiative. And that brings me through to the second icon here, which is in thinking slightly creatively around your own products and services, maybe as a business and a company. How can you bring your initiative to the forefront, keep your employees, customers and partners up to date, and potentially leverage your own technology to do something a bit new and creative with a social impact angle to it? And we have a flagship product called Icon, or Refinitiv Workspace, and used our mapping capabilities to plot out where those locations were. I said we've expanded to 4 now, and we've got those 4 locations as part of our mapping capabilities that employees, customers and partners can click on, zoom in, find out exactly where they are, types of species that we've helped plant or conserve, impact on the local area and communities. It's a great way to highlight and showcase your own passion through the products and services that you serve as an organization. And that touches slightly on the third icon that we see here, being corporate wide. Really, this is touching on and bringing to the forefront the inclusiveness of these projects and initiatives. Don't just think about one location. Don't just think about engaging a certain part of the business. Try and engage as many people as possible with this initiative. Make them feel and bring them with you on that journey as you start to expand your tree planting and conservation projects. We had so many employees suggest new sites, wanting to group together and start their own tree planting initiatives. There is an element of validating and vetting those requests to make sure that they are all good sites to fund and approved, etc. But really, it's a great way from an inclusivity perspective to bring everyone with you on that journey. And the final point I'll touch on is customers. The customer element of this wasn't initially something that we really ran with until we started to realize that actually the funding of the trees and the conservation projects that we were engaged with required constant funding, and it'd be nice for us to, yes, kickstart those initiatives, but we might as well leave it open for our customers, employees and partners to also contribute if they wanted to be a part of that journey themselves. So we have an online fundraising website called ticketaid.com, which is our own proprietary fundraising site that anyone can use. And we set up a Fund a Forest campaign on there, which partners with one of our coastal forest sites in Tanzania specifically, and at £3 per tree, you can help contribute to the funding of more trees in those coastal forest sites. So bring those customers, bring your clients with you on that journey if you can. We've seen event and marketing initiatives take off with incentives for people to join, where if you join, the business will commit to planting trees on the attendees' behalf. I only submitted an invoice last week in relation to funding some more trees as a result of one of those marketing and virtual event incentives. So it's a great way to engage clients as well. Conscious of time, but I think I'd really like to just quickly wrap up with three key takeaways from my experience running our global forest initiative for the past 8 months or so. Firstly, do it right. I think the importance of the steps, the figures, the validation, the approvals, everything that Vicky and David also touched on in their presentations, super important to ensure that those sites are, it's the right tree, it's the right space, it's the right reasons, I think was the phrase Vicky used. I think it's hugely important as you start to get employees suggesting sites for tree planting. You need to make sure that it is a very valid site and those sites will be maintained, and that they're certainly if you're looking at it from a carbon reduction perspective, that you'll be able to quantify that and realize those credits potentially in the future. Secondly, be prepared again for the huge waves of employees sending you emails with this, but have a process in place and a reasoning and clear justification as to what your line of attack is for the initiative, and make sure that rather than dampening those requests and disappointing employees, that there's always a way to bring them back into the conversation and make sure they're heard, but potentially that advice has been taken elsewhere to help fund a different type of initiative or project, or in a particular location that is verified and approved, etc. And then thirdly, think of the broader narrative. It isn't all about just planting trees. It is the conservation is a huge element to this as well, as is the biodiversity, the impact on the local communities. We actually didn't lead with carbon reduction or lead with our tree planting initiative as a way for us to reduce our carbon emissions or offset our carbon emissions. We ran with the local impact on local community and biodiversity angle, primarily because they were new trees, and we appreciate that this is a long-term commitment and engagement. And right now there were other priorities that or other impactful stories and narratives to tell that were specific to that location. So think about that as well. Think of the broader narrative. It's not just about the planting and the carbon. It's about a much bigger holistic sustainability journey that you're kickstarting, running with, and helping people join you along the way. And I'll leave it there to leave time for questions, Tom. Thank you very much.
Great stuff, Fab. Thanks a million there, Matt. And yeah, I can appreciate and recognize the number of emails you would have got from employees asking for certain projects to be included in the thought of. So feel the pain there. Look, wrapping up with a few questions, if I can. I'm going to group them up and give you one each and see if we can answer them in quick succession. First question to Vicky. Lots of questions have come in around this theme. So two parts. One, how do we actually measure and verify the carbon in the trees? Second part to that, how do we consider productive woodlands in the Woodland Carbon Code for measurement? I think people have that kind of view of the timber being taken away. So
okay, cool. So quick. So quickly, we have a methodology that projects use that involves physically going to the forest and actually measuring the diameter and height of trees, and Forest Research have a protocol which is kind of standard forest measurement stuff that converts those measurements into a volume of timber, which we then convert to an amount of carbon that's stored in the trees. So that's based in standard forest measurement techniques. In terms of productive forests are when typically in the UK you plant a productive species and we fell all the trees at one time for timber. So your woodland in carbon terms might have 800 tons of CO2 in it just before you fell it, but then you get rid of you move the timber from the forest and put it into forest products, which are going to be hanging about for a long time. But essentially in the forest, you've gone from 0 to 800 back to 0. So what we do is we say that you can claim the long-term average carbon benefit of that project, because that woodland creation is permanent. By definition, once you create a woodland in the UK, it's permanently woodland land use, so you have to replant it. So you can claim essentially the long-term average. So your woodland might grow up to 40 years, up to 800, go back to 0, go back up to 800, go back to 0 again. So you can claim the long-term average increase to the UK forest carbon stock, which might be, say 300 tons of CO2, not the 800.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Vicky. And I also appreciate there's probably some other forestry management approaches as well that we see in projects where it's not just clear fells, so some nuances in that too.
Yeah.
And David, a similar question to you, but from the landowner perspective. And these questions are important often because people often view solely that it's nature-based or native woodland creation, and it's not. It's important for landowners to have an economic model to make this viable. So just speak to the landowner's perspective of why it's important to have a blend of native and productive woodlands.
Okay, yeah, the native woodland is critical to us for habitat, really. So habitat is one of the big drivers for us on the estate. So that's protecting our water, primarily our watercourses, a buffer around our watercourses, and on steep banks, those areas that you're going to be looking into the woodland. So it's all done on visual impact assessments. So that stops this stark rectangular woodland dropping into the landscape that we see previously in areas. The productive woodland, the Sitka, we can grow trees really well in this country. So if I said that, the trees that we've planted 2 years ago, some of the highest are now 9 feet tall. It's incredible growth. We're in the Golden Triangle, and but we now practice on all our woodlands continual cover forestry. So that's just where you're taking small amounts of the trees out all the time. So you're not completely clear felling and having that stark look in the woodland, but more and more continual cover.
Thank you. Thanks a million, David. And one final question for Max. I'm at the cosh now on time. Advice. You've gone through this. You've looked at different options in terms of engaging employees and what matters most to you. Could you just give us a little bit of advice, 2 or 3 things for other business leaders to think about as they're designing their own programs and considering perhaps the inclusion of UK forestry?
Sure, absolutely. I'll be super quick on this, conscious of people's time. Make sure you pick the right partners. Make sure that you have a structure in place that can track and map that impact. There are a lot of avenues to go when it comes to tree planting, conservation initiatives. Some very enticing numbers coming from marketing materials, etc. But really do your research on validated land, validated sites, and make sure that there's the ability to track back over a various amount of time to map that impact. Some sites that came across our desk were maintained for 5-6 years, and that for us isn't a long-term initiative that we want to be involved with. So really look at the maintenance time frame of that, and if you're really committing large amounts of money and budget towards these initiatives, it should go a decent amount of time. So look at that time frame, make sure it's approved, accredited, and that you're working with the right partners.
Yeah, thanks, William, Matt. And with that, we're at time. And so I want to thank all of our speakers, and once again, everyone in the audience too, for attending and asking the questions. We didn't get to all the questions, so for those of you that have asked one that wasn't covered off, we'll be following that up in an email addressed to everybody. A webinar recording will be available on our website and will be sent out to everybody shortly, so please feel free to share it with colleagues and others. Just before I break, in case you were curious what my favorite woodland creature was, I'm totally going to bend the rules on this one, but it's actually kind of fungi. I know it's closer to a creature than it is a plant, but just the concept of having this network beneath our feet that connects all the dots up in terms of our living ecosystem, and that's kind of what we need to do here today, right, in terms of climate action. So thanks all once again, have a lovely evening, and see you next time.